Last night I had the strangest dream I've ever dreamed before. I dreamt the world had all agreed to put an end to war. I dreamt and saw a mighty room, and the room was filled with men. And the paper they were signing said they'd never fight again. And when that paper was all signed and 1,000,000 copies made, they all joined hands and bowed their heads. Grateful prayers were prayed. And the bee...
Hit squad's looking for me. So the title of this lecture, if you're not familiar with modern Iraqi history, you may wonder where this comes from. Saddam Hussein, in his endless delusion, referred to the Gulf War as the mother of all battles, that he was going to win, and this was this great thing. And of course, nothing of the sort happened, as we saw last time. So I thought that we would just flip it around in talking about our actions and our behavior starting in 2003, well, really, as you can see before that, and call it the mother of all stupidities. And it's really quite stunning. We've seen a lot of really seriously deluded policies throughout history, in modern history, by Western powers, by the British and by the Americans. But in some ways, the policy towards Iraq, starting in invading Iraq, was really, in some ways, the crowning glory of this really set of extremely foolish policies. We should have known. I mean, after all, long ago, the revolutionary Maximilien Robespierre said that no one loves armed missionaries. This is perfectly natural. You repulse them as enemies. You can encourage freedom, but you can't create it by invading force. And we, of course, ignored this. And as I think I mentioned last time, there was a phalanx of people who'd spent their lives studying the region, studying international relations, all of them saying, don't do this. There were so-called realist political scientists like Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer, who published an article in Foreign Policy magazine called An Unnecessary War, pointing out how it was not necessary from any strategic calculation of the U.S. Many, many Middle Eastern types said this is completely nuts. Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt, who is one of our closest allies in the Middle East, pleaded with the Bush administration saying, if you do this, you will open the gates of hell. So there were plenty of people saying, don't do this, and we'll see, of course, what happened. So in a sense, once again, the Hannah Arendt quote about nothing which was being done, no matter how stupid, no matter how many people knew and foretold the consequences, could be undone or prevented. So in thinking about the nature, thinking about Americans' invasion and occupation of Iraq, the place to start, of course, is we've been looking at the whole history of this. It can't be understood apart from the history. And we saw last time that the aftermath of Desert Storm was really quite a Pyrrhic victory. And in the 1990s, there were a series of things we need to remember. Iraq was placed under very severe sanctions. It was highly isolated diplomatically. What this meant was that the Iraqi state was increasingly hollowed out. There was increasingly less and less capable, and yet it still managed to hold itself together. There was an increasing reliance by Saddam on clans. If you think about it, one way to focus on this history is that what was the contribution of the 1990s to the kind of resistance and the kind of violence that erupted after the Americans got there? And this is one piece. The state itself was already weak. We would finish it off. Everyone in the world always has to look somewhere for protection against all kinds of enemies locally when anarchy breaks out, and this increasingly became clan and ethnic and sectarian based. There was a fostering by Saddam of Islamic nationalism as a way to shore up his regime. We saw last time that he put the words Allahu Akbar, God is most great, at the beginning of the call to prayer in the Muslim in Islam, and he put it on the Iraqi flag in his own handwriting, a kind of appeal, a sort of Islamic appeal. But of course, other people would also take up this same thing, and this was an encouragement to people who had typically been his enemies, the Islamists. The Kurds achieved something like autonomy in the north. But just because you get autonomy doesn't mean that peace breaks out, because there was, in fact, a civil war between different factions of Kurds between 1994 and 1997. We don't really have time to go into this, but it was very complex with Iranians on one side. And in fact, one of the groups of Mustafa Barzani, actually sided with Saddam Hussein and did a short-term alliance with Saddam. So this is, again, something that Americans have to remember in the Middle East. Beware of thinking these are the good guys and those are the bad guys, because this is a place that is an exceptionally rough political neighborhood with all kinds of different groups. It's not 1 against 2, it's 1 against 13 or 27, and so people are always making alliances of convenience in order to survive. They flip, they flop, they join this group, they join that group. So the notion that this is the good group and that is the bad group is a very dangerous way to think about this part of the world. The Shia, as we saw, were oppressed, bitter, and waiting. They had risen in revolt. That revolt had been brutally suppressed by Saddam's elite troops, and so now they were waiting. He continued to attack the Shia with a dramatic attack in 1999, where he attacked the two most powerful families of clerics. The Sadiq al-Sadr family was attacked. The only one really who survived was Muqtada, who was a younger son in the family who fled. And various members of the other big family of the al-Hakims were also killed. Internationally, there were a number of developments that matter. The sanctions regime was very unpopular with other Arab Sunni states. They didn't like it. They understood the consequences for the Iraqi people. They tried to get it lifted. The UN also had set up an inspections regime, inspections looking for weapons of mass destruction. This, unfortunately, the special commission in 1998 that was looking turned out to contain CIA, MI6, that's the British CIA, and Mossad, the Israeli CIA agents, and so, of course, Saddam kicked them out. This was a pretext. He was dying to get rid of these inspectors, but he did. And so then we bombed him. It was called Operation Desert Fox. Bill Clinton sent in the Air Force, and we bombed Iraq. And then in 1998, the U.S. Congress passed something called the Iraq Liberation Act, where $100 million was being funneled to specific exile groups. Once again, Americans thinking that they knew what was going on, they knew who were the good guys, just as we thought the same thing you may recall in Afghanistan, and you know how well that worked out. Well, this will work out just as well, as we'll see. And there was then a steady drumbeat, particularly among the neoconservatives, advocating war. They were advocating war. They were saying this was an unnecessary thing to do. It was a good thing to do. All kinds of good things would happen as a result of this war, and this is what they continued to say. I have to say a few more things about the sanctions regime. We've already looked at the human cost, so I'm not going to repeat that here today. Instead, I want to look at the political consequences of sanctions. The regime, again, there are two reasons for thinking about this. One, to understand what happened to Iraqi society on the eve of the American invasion, so you can get a better insight into how the Iraqi society was likely to respond. And two, because today we have a steady drumbeat of people talking about increasing sanctions on Iran. So what's the track record with sanctions? How well do they work? Well, turns out, even though these sanctions were extremely severe, much more severe than any contemplated sanctions on Iran, the government of Iraq under Saddam was still able to funnel resources to its own supporters. The American view was that Saddam had lost this big war and somebody in his entourage was likely to overthrow him. There was actually an attempt, but it was bungled, and the people who did it were, of course, killed by Saddam. But the notion that these regimes are brittle is easily overdrawn. Brutal, yes. Dictatorial, to be certain. But whether or not that means they're necessarily going to fall is an entirely different story. The sanctions had the effect of destroying the Iraqi middle class, which had been relatively small, let's say in the 1950s, but of course with the boom in oil rents and all the development projects and the push for education and training had actually grown to be a rather substantial segment of Iraqi society in the cities. But they were destroyed, their savings were wiped out, they had to sell their belongings on the street. It was quite a mess. It also undermined the secular educational system, which of course meant people turned elsewhere. And this is a quote from a man that I had some dealings with, is a Lieutenant Colonel Ahmed Hashim. He's an Egyptian-American, U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel, and who said that what was happening was this: growth of illiteracy, despair, and anomie, meaning it's a sociological word, just meaning nobody knows what's going on, everybody's very alienated and upset. And it led to people seeking succor in religion. So all of this was fairly well known. It wasn't easy to find out, but it wasn't too hard. But nevertheless, all this was ignored because you can see where this would point. If you then came in and wiped out this already weakened state, a state that depends entirely for its support on a certain cadre, a certain segment of a minority group, the Sunni Arabs, you get rid of that state, you smash that state. In a very violent society, there's going to be, first, a great deal of violence. And second, people will look to find ways to protect themselves. And what that's going to be are groups, armed groups, organized around the principles of clan and religion. And that's exactly what happened. And people in Washington would say, oh no, this is going to happen. And we would say, you're living on, what planet are you living on? What are you talking about? Alas, we were right, they were wrong, but never mind, they were the ones making the decision. So the decision to invade was made. Now this had been long a desire of neocons and militant nationalists. Again, one of the purposes of this class is for you to make up your own mind about exactly how this works. But if you, I think, take these lectures on Iraq and combine them with the lectures on American nationalism and the rise of American militarism, you get a pretty good idea of what this confluence of forces might have been that led to this. 9/11, of course, was a pretext. They had wanted to do this, the neocons and their militant nationalist allies like Cheney, had long wanted to do this. They talked about it in the 1990s. But there was no way you could get the American people to support it. But then along came 9/11. Everyone was traumatized. Everyone was ranting about, we need revenge, we need to do something. People even said this. There was supposedly, a man named Michael Ledeen, a neocon, is alleged to have said that the United States needs every now and then to pick up some crappy little country and throw it against the wall in order to show that it's powerful. How it was that this kind of language of the schoolyard bully would become part of American political discourse, I suppose, can really be traced to 9/11. One would hope that before 9/11 people would not have listened to this, but in the atmosphere of 9/11 they did. Unlike in 1990, when the United States had a great deal of international support, certainly in NATO, certainly in Europe, and as we've seen, additionally from the Soviet Union, from the acquiescence of the Chinese, and even support from Egypt and Syria in Operation Desert Storm, and from Saudi Arabia. We had none of that support, with the exception of the British, under the leadership of Tony Blair, but there was a great deal of opposition even in England. So this was a very different situation. Most people in the world were not supporting this, whereas they thought they were split, but there was much more support for Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And there were huge worldwide protests. Literally millions of people demonstrated all over the world, in Asia, in Latin America, in Europe, in Africa, North and South America, and Bush did it anyway. Now, one thing that's very interesting to look at here is the career of a particular gentleman, a man named Ahmed Chalabi. He was an MIT undergraduate and a Chicago PhD in mathematics, very intelligent guy. He was a banker. He was under indictment for fraud in Jordan. And he was a leading advocate of U.S. invasion. He was one of these exiles that was getting a lot of money from the U.S. government. He claimed that he knew, in quotes, that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. He claimed that he knew that Saddam had links to Al-Qaeda. And he was viewed in Washington as an independent, pro-American, modernist Iraqi who just happened to be a Shi'i Muslim. And that was the view of him. Okay? The CIA was not so impressed. They distrusted him, but they more or less went along with this. Here he is. Here's Ahmed Chalabi. Jim Hoagland of the Washington Post held him up as a notable force for democracy. And here he is as a special guest of Laura Bush, shown here, at the State of the Union address in 2004, which was right after the American invasion in April of 2003. There's a famous saying in the intelligence business that the world of intelligence is a wilderness of mirrors. You never really know what's going on. And if you've been following the news recently, you may have seen that Mr. Chalabi is again in the news. He has nine political lives, like the mythical cat. He came back to Iraq with the exiles. He was quickly sidelined, but he's made a comeback. He is the ultimate political survivor, and he's now running a commission on the election for the Iraqi government in which he is preventing all kinds of Sunnis running for political office on the grounds that they were connected to the old regime. General Odierno, who was the top U.S. military commander in Iraq, a few days ago publicly accused Ahmed Chalabi of links to the Quds Force, which is part of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, saying that he was clearly influenced by Iran. Quote, "We have direct intelligence that tells us that," speaking on February 16th at what is frankly a right-wing think tank, the Institute for the Study of War in Washington, D.C. So there are two views on Ahmed Chalabi. One is that he's simply an opportunist and a nationalist, and the other is that he was an Iranian agent. If he had been an Iranian agent, it may have been one of the greatest intelligence coups in the history of intelligence because he lured the United States into doing exactly what benefited the Islamic Republic of Iran, as we will see momentarily. Okay, so we go in. Yes, question? Yeah, I think there should be. That's not it. There. Okay, sure. So let's just sketch the phases of the war, and then we'll go into this in a little more detail in a minute. So, first of all, we came in April of 2003, and this, although there was some modest resistance here and there were pockets of it. There was more resistance than in Operation Desert Storm, but nevertheless, the United States Army and Marine Corps very quickly rolled up to Baghdad. There was almost immediately a complete breakdown of order in Baghdad, which, remember, is a very large city. We're talking 7 to 8 to 10 million people here. It's a very big city. And there was no state, no police, no nothing. And then, all of a sudden, there's looting, failure to establish order, and we set up something called the Coalition Provisional Authority. Shortly thereafter, an insurgency based in the Sunni community emerged, led by either Ba'athis or Takfiri jihadis of one sort or another. It was very mixed. It was very complicated. We'll talk about it in a bit. These later, especially the jihadis, we think, but we're not sure, maybe the Ba'athis too, made the fatal mistake of attacking the Shi'as more and more and more. The Shi'as finally lost patience in February 2006, and this led to a thing called the Battle for Baghdad, which was where most of the just extraordinary violence took place, and the city of Baghdad was ethnically cleansed of Sunnis. It was extremely violent. The United States, then, a set of things happened. American policy changed, and things on the ground in Iraq were also changing. This is called the surge. We'll talk about that in a minute. Then there's a struggle over the status of forces agreement, which takes us all the way down to the election of Barack Obama, and then we get to the waiting for Obama to see what is going to happen next. So that's just the brief outline. Now we're going to go through it and look at some specifics about this war. Well, of course, this war was another Pyrrhic victory, to put it mildly. We rolled into Baghdad. We met only pockets of resistance. And the triumphalism in this country absolutely ran wild about how this was a glorious victory. It shows that we can do anything. There was the notion that our military was so dominant. It was really a recapitulation of the things that was said after the initial invasion of Afghanistan. What happened was that on October 2002, that is to say, about 6 months before the American invasion, when it became increasingly apparent that this was going to happen, Saddam declared an amnesty and opened all the jails in Iraq. So all of a sudden, you got a large number of criminals who are out there. Now, what's very interesting is that those criminals didn't do very much until the Americans got there. But this was, again, something that was a strategy to try to do something. And in the looting process, remember, this looting, some of it was probably organized, some of it was not. And this is in a city of people who had been made desperate by a decade of sanctions. And so when the state was decapitated, we simply abolished the Iraqi state, and we did nothing, put nothing in its place initially. People simply looted and destroyed 17 out of 23 ministries. There was, of course, this destroyed the bureaucratic infrastructure of the country. The only ministry that the United States Armed Forces protected was the oil ministry. Very interesting. They put forces around the oil ministry to guard it and protect it, but all kinds of other ministries were looted, were gutted. The Iraqi National Museum was raided. This has treasures that go back 3,000 to 4,000 to 5,000 years. It was raided. People were all over the place. All kinds of things were going on. And this was also highly significant. The borders of Iraq, which, remember, include a 1,500, I believe, mile border with Iran, was entirely unprotected for months. Right? Now, if you think, I simply do not understand how people in Washington could have thought that Iran, which has long, deep, centuries-old connections through Shi'ism with the country of Iraq and with the Shi'is of Iraq, the notion that a state like Iran, which views the United States as an adversary, was not going to take advantage of this, well, it boggles the mind, but then again, there it is. Within a few months, an insurgency began. And once again, we can see, though, this was not what was being talked about in the United States, because, of course, as usual, as so often, Greek myths are very helpful. We had this triumphal hubris where George Bush landed on an aircraft carrier conveniently parked off the coast of San Diego with mission accomplished. Well, not so much. All right. So we smashed the Iraqi state, and the initial idea was to put in its place this group of exiles. There were two big problems with that plan. The first problem was nobody supported these exiles. The second big problem was there was no Iraqi state to take over because it had been first gutted by the years of sanctions, and second had been decapitated and collapsed through the looting and the destruction in the aftermath of our invasion. So then we set in this gentleman, who truly is a modern Lord Elphinstone. His name is Paul Bremer, and he was head of something that we set up called the Coalitional Provisional Authority. What we did, in effect, was set up an explicit occupation government. We set up a government run by and staffed at the top by Americans to run this country of Iraq. This man had no Middle Eastern experience. He had worked in places like Indonesia. He had some experience with the Muslim world, but he had none in the Middle East. He did not speak Arabic. And he was also a neoliberal ideologue. He thought that the important thing to do was to privatize everything in Iraq. He had great plans for setting up an Iraqi stock exchange. This is where there is no order, there is no electricity, there is no water. This is a man whose view of the world was a little out of variance with realities on the ground, to put it mildly. And, of course, his greatest contribution was that he disbanded the Iraqi army. Now, on this question of disbanding the Iraqi army, which of course instantly created a set of enemies in the entire officer corps of the former Iraqi army, most of whom were Sunnis. You can see where that will go. It's also, however, in fairness to Bremer, it's important to say that disbanding the Iraqi army was a key demand of some of the big Shia ayatollahs. They wanted this army disbanded. They understood perfectly well what was going on. Their goal was to take over the Iraqi state themselves. And in this, they have largely succeeded. So disbanding the Iraqi army was indeed an exceptionally stupid thing to do, but there were also some domestic pressures on the U.S. to do this. This, of course, helped jumpstart the insurgency. This was pretty much inevitable once we did this. We only had 140,000 troops in the country. This is a large country with undefended borders. They could not be in everywhere at the same time. We had smashed the Iraqi state, and then with the looting and the disbanding of the army, and then these decrees of de-Baathification, which were really modeled on the denazification edicts that were passed in occupied Germany. The idea was to root out people with this evil ideology and so on. But of course, the trouble was that anybody who was in the professional world had to join the Ba'ath Party simply in order to get ahead. It's sort of like saying, well, if you want to really get ahead in some communist regimes, you need to be a member of the Communist Party. So it was a little similar. Membership in the party or affiliation with the party did not necessarily say a great deal about what your ideology actually was, but nevertheless, it impacted these people. We completely misunderstood internal Iraqi splits. We failed but this was huge. I remember this at the time in Washington. People would say, oh no, the Islamists, they're not very important. Why, there are all these other people. And I would say, what are you talking about? And people like Colonel Hashim would say, what are you talking about? But that's what, and of course we also failed to grasp the inevitable links of the Shia with Iran, which go back centuries. So, we then, into this witch's brew, add corruption and incompetence. I love this statistic. Something like 300 tons of shrink-wrapped $100 bills. That's a lot of money, folks. How much? Well, about $12 billion. It was flown in to Iraq. I mean, there's no electricity, there are no credit cards, there's no banking system, so it's a cash-only economy. So you literally fly in these bills. According to the General Accounting Office of the U.S. Congress, $8 billion has gone missing. It's unaccounted for. That's a lot of money. Think what you might have been able to do with this at the University of California, for example. They spent $600 million where there's no paperwork at all. This is unheard of in the United States government. I mean, yes, perhaps we have too much bureaucracy, but it does, at least, is a kind of break on corruption to have all those accounting slips that have to be filed. People can trace the paper. Well, they didn't do it. In the final month, they let out $5 billion in no tender contracts. And a no tender contract means there is no competitive bidding on the contract. There were no auditors at all for a year and 50 months. And what did it accomplish? Electricity was typically less than 6 hours a day. So in other words, all this money came in. It basically disappeared. Some Americans were stealing it. Some Iraqis were stealing it. And this was widely known to the Iraqis. This was not exactly a demonstration of good governance. So the Coalition for Provisional Authority was politically incompetent, corrupt, and hopelessly at variance with Iraqi history in the sense of Iraqi nationalism and the demands of the different communities, which, of course, are also very much in conflict with each other. In terms of understanding what happened next, this man is absolutely key. It is Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani. He is almost certainly the most powerful man in Iraq, and he lives in a small, modest apartment in Baghdad. If you know your geography and you look at his last name, his just means Ali the Sistani, the man from Sistan. Sistan is a region of Iran. He speaks Arabic with a Farsi accent. This is very typical. There are all kinds, because of the nature of Shia Islam, there are Iraqis studying in Iran, there are Iranians studying in Iraq. They go back and forth, they always have, they intermarry. This is one sort of cultural zone. So he lives in Iraq, and he is a very powerful Ayatollah. He has, to this day, adamantly refused to meet a single representative of the United States government. He will not receive them, despite lots of pressure to do so. He will not talk to them on nationalist grounds. His goal is very clear. He wants the Shia to be running things in Iraq. He is not a follower of the Imam Khomeini's philosophy, the idea of the government by the clerics. His idea is much more similar to the more traditional Shia clergy's view that the clergy are kind of operate as the veto power. They sort of stand to one side. They're the voice of morality, and then they watch what the state does, and they make sure the state doesn't cross all kinds of red lines in their view. And this is what he thinks should be done. For example, in the election today that's going on, sure, no problem. In the election that's going on today, he is refusing to take sides among any of the different Shi'i parties. He's not saying this party, that party. He's just saying, but pay attention. He forced the United States to hold elections. He made us do this, and the reason was simple. When we were faced with an insurgency from the Sunni community, which was tying down the U.S. military, a guy who could, with a single speech, could have, if he wanted, turn hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Shia into the streets, the occupation would have become completely unmanageable. And so therefore, because we invaded and because we were fighting the Sunnis, we had to give the Ayatollah Sistani what he wanted, which was a set of elections, and we'll see what happened with those elections in a moment. So, the Sunni insurgency. This went on for about 4 years. It was a very shadowy group. It was very similar to the resistance in Afghanistan, you may remember, where there were lots of different groups. It's not like a kind of unified Leninist opposition. You had lots of groups who may not have gotten along with each other. There were lots of Takfiris. There were also Sunni nationalists. There were Baathists. There were all kinds of people doing this. To this day, nobody really knows exactly who was doing what. Saddam, I mentioned, was fostering a kind of Islamic nationalism. Sunni Baathists and military officers and non-coms who'd all lost their jobs, many of them with considerable military skills, joined the insurgency. And then there was a kind of interaction of clumsy American tactics where we would be looking for people that were shooting at American soldiers. We would go into people's homes. We would kick down doors, which, to put it mildly, is anathema in the Muslim world, particularly in the Iraqi world. And so, in this kind of thing, enraged the locals. There's a tribal culture of revenge, and as well as Islamic appeals. And all then you began to get Takfiri jihadis coming in from elsewhere, and the borders are wide open anyway, so that's pretty easy. So, as it was said on the run-up to the Iraq War, this poster was absolutely true. The famous World War I poster of Uncle Sam saying, "I want you to join the U.S. Army." Someone took this and changed it digitally and had Osama bin Laden saying, "I want you to invade Iraq," because it was a massive propaganda windfall for Al-Qaeda. So, initially, then, this Iraqi state has been destroyed. There's nothing in its place. There's looting. An insurgency is just beginning. The United Nations says, okay, well, under a lot of American pressure, we'll set up a headquarters and we'll try to work with the Coalition Provision Authority. The UN typically does that kind of thing in the aftermath of wars. And they did this, but clearly the Sunni insurgency didn't want that to happen. They wanted this to be an American occupation, They didn't want any imprimatur of political legitimacy from the UN. So how do you get that? Simple. Kill everybody in the UN, which is what they did on August 19th, 2003. And the UN headquarters in Baghdad was hit by a massive truck bomb, which blew up the building and killed Sergio Vieira de Mello, who was the head of the thing, and this fellow right here, whose name is Rick Hooper. Who was killed in this block. He was an honors graduate in politics and economics from UCSC. He got an MA from the Center for Arab Studies. I knew him as an undergraduate when he was here. He worked for the UN for years in the West Bank and Gaza. I met him in Gaza at one point, and he took me all around the place showing me to it. And he was the first special assistant. He was a rising star in the UN system. His Arabic was flawless. He was very well trained. He was very smart. He worked very hard. He was special assistant to the UN Under Secretary General for Political Affairs, which is how he wound up being in Baghdad, and he was killed in this explosion. In his honor, UCSC does have a scholarship. It's not a lot of money. We did our best in terms of raising it. There's an award made to benefit a student studying Arabic in the Arab Middle East, and there's the website if you are interested in it. So, this is something to notice, okay? We're not talking about abstractions here. We're talking about actual people getting actually killed. It happens a lot. And it happens particularly when people who don't know what they're doing fondly imagine that history will not apply to them. So the insurgency continues, and it becomes a war of the IED, improvised explosive device. This is of great significance because what they did, these are basically car bombs, booby traps, all kinds of things that blow up the car bomb. They're basically very simple. You take fertilizer, you take fuel oil, you get and you wire it up with some kind of a switch, and then you have some kind of remote control device, and you blow things up. So what were the political consequences of all of this? American troops start getting killed. It starts being quite random. American troops to this day never know from one moment to the next where's the war zone, where is it not. The answer is everywhere is the war zone. There is no front. This is a war in which at any moment you can lose your life, and they were under attack. So this then had political consequences. The first was that the Americans retreated into the Green Zone, which is this heavily fortified region of Baghdad. They built big blast walls, and they didn't go out because they were afraid, with good reason, that they would probably be killed if they did. But of course, if you're trying to govern a country where you don't know very much, and most people who are working there don't even speak the language, if you don't get out, you are not going to know what's going on. You will remain utterly clueless. And so this increased the isolation and the lack of information and the lack of understanding of Americans by retreating into the Green Zone, which meant that then we increasingly did what we know how to do, which is use force. Kinetic force, as the military likes to say, is something that the U.S. military is extraordinarily good at. We do this very, very well. Probably no one in the world does it better than we do. And the problem is that it has all kinds of unfortunate political consequences when it is, as it typically would be under this situation, misapplied politically. And then there was a need for intelligence. We were desperate to get intelligence about who was doing this, who was blowing us up, who was shooting at us, who was blowing up things, and who was committing all this violence. It's also true that the Bush administration believed that torture was okay, and this is the origins of the campaign for torture and the rise of Abu Ghraib, which did so much damage to America's reputation when it came out. They were desperate also for political progress because, of course, the war began to become even more unpopular in the United States. They said, well, mission accomplished, what are you talking about? I mean, there are all these American soldiers being killed. What's going on here? So we were desperate for political progress. We were forced, in effect, by the violence, by the Sunni insurgency. We were not able to pursue this long-term occupation, which some people in the Provisional Authority wanted to do, which some neocons at the time thought would be a good thing. The Sunni insurgency made this impossible. And finally, what we did is as I've mentioned, we moved in the direction of direct elections in order to appease the Ayatollah Sistani. What happened was that initially, Bremer, the head of the CPA, said, well, we Americans will write a new constitution. Oh, sure, Iraqis will consult with us, but we Americans will play the main role. Sistani said, you'll do nothing of the kind, through his representatives. He said, don't do this. If you do this, I'll declare jihad against you. This is completely illegitimate. You are foreigners. You cannot write our constitution. How shall we write the Constitution, Mr. Sistani? He said, hold an election. Hold an election of Iraqis, and then those delegates will write the Constitution. And then we'll have another election. We didn't want to have elections. Right? We talked a lot about how glorious it was after the elections were held, but beforehand, we really did not want to have these elections because many members of the Bush administration wanted a direct rule by the Coalition Provisional Authority. Pictures often are better than 1,000 words. This picture tells you all you need to know about why there was an insurgency for a long time in Iraq. If you've ever been inside a mosque, this is sort of the equivalent of stomping in with your boots into a Catholic church and sort of walking up to the sacristy and throwing down the Eucharist and stuff like this. I mean, you don't wear boots, you don't break things, you don't carry weapons into mosque. This way, and these people are foreigners, and they don't speak Arabic, and they're not Muslims. This was, of course, viewed as an outrage. Now, the reason why they were there was because they were probably being fired upon by guys up in the minarets. Okay, but that's the way it goes, right? So either you let them shoot at you, or you go in and create even more enemies. And this was the kind of classic problem of the politics of an insurgency that the U.S. faced. Here's an occupation with U.S. women troops searching someone. We were always searching, looking for IEDs. Sometimes we just found sheep. And here's somebody's house, again, showing U.S. troops. So here are guys who probably, almost certainly don't speak Arabic. These people probably don't speak English. And there are people who can't speak to each other. They're foreigners. They look weird. They're armed to the teeth. They come into your house. Pretty scary, right? And really offensive. And so they then say to their sons, what's this about? And the sons say, well, we don't like this either, so we're going to fight. And so you get this kind of resistance that begins to grow. This happens over and over again. We saw this happen in Afghanistan, first against the British, then against the Russians, now against the Americans, and the same thing happened in Iraq. It happened in Asia during the Cold War. It happens over and over and over again. So the resistance begins, and then a crucial event occurs in the Sunni Arab town of Fallujah on the road between Baghdad and Syria. There were some mercenaries from the company then known as Blackwater, now known as XE, who were killed. They got lost. They were Westerners, big tough guys, but the mob overpowered them, killed them, burned their bodies, and hanged their bodies on the bridge. I remember at the time talking about the Iraq War with Egyptians, and they said this is basically the equivalent of if you invaded Texas. The Iraqis have a reputation of being something like the Texans of the Arab world. That is, they like to shoot. And so this is what happened. And so there was some inconclusive fighting at first, and then a decision was made by the Bush administration for a counterattack in the immediate aftermath of Bush's victory in the election of November. In November 2004, there was a massive counterattack by the U.S. Marine Corps, which devastated the city of Fallujah. This is what Fallujah looked like. The Washington Post talk about even the dogs have started to die, their corpses are strewn, etc., etc. This place was wrecked. We to this day do not know the full extent of the damage that was done. Just today in the news, there were some allegations of, looks like, possibility of an increase in birth defects amongst children, not scientifically established, but is the guess of Iraqi doctors in hospitals in Fallujah. One wonders why. People suspect various chemicals, but there is, as yet, no direct evidence about this. But the city of Fallujah was comprehensively destroyed. So, Fallujah was devastated, and this had huge political consequences, because this is in November 2004, and the elections are slated for January of 2005, only a few months later. And so what happens? The Sunnis boycotted the election, which, on their part, was a fatal political error. It was an error for them in terms of their own interests, but that's also the way the world works. People often make mistakes. People do things that actually do not work out to be in their own interests, and what this ensured was a Shia Kurdish victory and takeover of the Iraqi state. And they're going to be very reluctant to let go of that. Okay? So this is, again, once you get your hands on the state, if the state starts to reconstitute and oil rents begin to become more available, this is what's happening. So what about the Shia? What was going? Well, the Shia had lots of internal divisions. Sistani was sort of saying, yeah, we know what we'd like to not see. We don't want Saddam. We don't want the Ba'ath. We want the Shi'i to be powerful. But I don't want rule like the Ayatollah. Muqtada al-Sadr, who was the leader of a thing called the Jaysh al-Mahdi, the army of the Mahdi, of the sort of the guy who comes down at the end of time. It's sort of an end times idea. It's the equivalent of Jesus coming back at the end of days. And he was running a big organization in the giant slum of Sadr City, so-called, named in honor of his father. Sort of an army or a group of very, very tough slum kids who were organized along these lines. And there's a kind of intermediate, kind of middle-class activism by Al-Hakim and Al-Maliki, the head of Al-Dawah, this guy right here, Maliki. Right. We're dead. Okay. And so we get Muqtada actually took on the United States military in the city of Najaf in 2004. Now, Najaf was more of a stronghold of people like Al-Hakim and Al-Maliki rather than of Muqtada, but he took a stand, and it was very destructive. He took heavy losses, and they actually learned something from this. And what they learned from this was it's a mistake to take the U.S. Army on directly. Don't fight them directly, Army and Marines. Don't take on the U.S. military directly. Wait, be patient, and sooner or later we will be able to take over the Iraqi state, which is effectively what happened. They suffered heavy losses, and a ceasefire was negotiated. Seen this slide before. This just shows the three sort of major groups at the time. These have shifted around since. there are all these different tendencies. Because remember, I mean, the Shia Arabs are probably 60% of the population of the country. And so then they're also split. They're split also in terms of class location. Some of them are extremely poor. Some of them are middle-class professionals. These people often don't see eye to eye. And then there are all kinds of different tendencies ideologically, religiously within that community. So there are lots of differences, lots of different views. But these are some of the main things. But there is a kind of one thing that happened as a result of the fall of Saddam was that the Shi'i could again begin to hold their large religious pilgrimages and periods of mourning. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Shi'i Islam in talking about Iran. But this will be a whole course, of course. But the short story is the nature of Shi'i Islam is in some ways more similar to, in terms of its mythological structure, has some similarities with the mythological structure of Christianity, in the sense that there was a historical event in which the representative of God, not in their case a literal embodiment of God as in the Christian myth, but that there was a person who was specially holy, who stood for justice, and who was then martyred. He was killed by the forces of injustice, by the state that represented bad things, and that then we who are the successors of this virtuous man, then we do two things. We feel grief at his death, and we also seek to emulate what he does. And so, you may know, in some Roman Catholic countries, for example in the Philippines, during Semana Santa, during Holy Week and the run-up to Easter, there are often processions where people literally reenact the crucifixion. Where guys will go around and have themselves tied up onto crucifixes and be carried through the streets. Sometimes they even have nails pounded into them. Well, they do something very similar in Shi'i Islam. It's called Ashura. It is a commemoration of this martyrdom of the Imam Hussein, it was called. And so you see what they do. So the point of this is that there is a culture of sacrifice for the cause of righteousness, sacrifice for the cause of justice, and a deep suspicion of the authorities that they are actually forces of evil, particularly if they're Sunnis. So this was the ideology very much of this Jaysh al-Mahdi, the army of the Mahdi, the anointed one who's supposed to come back at the end of time. Here's a demonstrator demonstrating against the Americans in May of 2003. What you might ask, well, what's he doing here? Who is this picture? That's the picture of the Imam Hussein, who is the man who was killed and martyred back in the 7th century. And there is the way in which, again, these religious symbols are used for political purposes. And so the Shia get ready to take over the state. Sistani, as I mentioned, demanded direct elections, both for the constitutional referendum, first to get the representatives, then to have a referendum on the Constitution, then to have the Parliament. And the CPA, the U.S. authorities, fearing his power, conceded. He forged unity electorally among the Shi'i, which meant that the election became a referendum on sectarian loyalties. Everybody voted for their sectarian group. And since the Sunnis were boycotting it, what happened? They didn't boycott the constitutional election, but 3 out of 4 of them rejected the Constitution. And the idea was that there had to be a minimum number of provinces to accept the new Constitution. That almost failed. It only won because this 4th mixed province, 51% voted in favor, and there's wide suspicion in the Sunni community that there was vote tampering. But that's what happened. Elsewhere, 94+% voted in favor of the Constitution. So you're going to get the idea. From the beginning, and this should be no surprise to you, given what you already know about the modern history of Iraq. No surprise that the Sunnis were adamantly opposed to the invasion, to the occupation, to this new state, to the empowerment of the Shia and the Kurds, whereas the Shia felt exactly the opposite. They were delighted to have the opportunity to take over the Iraqi state at long last in the case of the Shia, or in the case of the Kurds, at last to be left alone up in their area. So the Kurds are pragmatists sometimes. They would love to have their own independent state, but they realistically, and this is quite realistic, don't think they can achieve this for the simple reason that it's opposed by everybody in the region. It's opposed most importantly by the Turks, which have easily the strongest army in the region, and by the Iranians, who arguably might be a match of the Turks, but they're not interested in fighting each other, fortunately, and also by all of the Arabs are also opposed to this. So the Kurds understand they can't do this. So the next best thing is to make sure that you're allied with the Shi'i and make sure that you're necessary for the Shi'i to get what they want. Make sure the state of Iraq is decentralized, meaning that the central government in Baghdad can't really do anything in Kurdish provinces. Encourage the Iraqi state to stay out of Kurdish areas as much as possible, and they stay out of those areas, except that there's a dispute around the mixed city of Kirkuk, which, you guessed it, has lots of oil. And so to the right now, there is concern about this contest and this struggle about oil. Once again, you see how oil weaving in with trying to create a modern state and a vociferous society with foreign intervention all creates a very heady and very vicious witch's brew. So, violence is continuing, and as the insurgents, particularly many think, although there's uncertainty here, particularly with the rise of takfiris from outside of Iraq and local takfiris, people coming in from Jordan, from Yemen, from all over the place. These people were takfiris. They're these sort of fanatical Wahhabi types, and they, as we know, have long regarded the Shia as apostates, as not real Muslims, and so they think it's legitimate to attack the Shia, and so they began doing this. Okay? There's escalating violence in this 3-year period. The insurgency is based in the Sunni communities, although there was that conflict, and there were repeated attacks on the Shi'i community. Okay? There was some response to this, but on the whole, Sistani kept saying, be patient, don't blow it, don't lose it, don't retaliate en masse. And that kind of continued, but of course you can see how this is going. As you get more and more provocations, more and more attacks, and the Shi'i themselves are returning the attacks to some extent, and you get this kind of snowballing, and then finally the lid literally gets blown off on February 23rd, 2006, because there is the Al-Askari Mosque in Samarra. It is a gorgeous building, as you can see. It has a gold leaf on the domes and the minarets. It is the tomb of 2 of the 12 Shi'i imams. Their idea is that after Ali and Hussein, there were a succession of their descendants, all the way down to the 12th one who disappeared. He's the one who's supposed to come back. Actually, he's supposed to come back with Jesus in their religion at the end of times to establish the reign of justice. So these imams who were still alive are, to put it mildly, sort of semi-divine, very important characters, and 2 of them are buried in this mosque. Here's another view of it. And the Takfiris blew it up on February 23rd, 2006. That's sort of the before and after picture. So you can see what happened. They blew a whole hole in it. And that was it. The Shia then said, okay, we're done. And they began to wreak a terrible revenge on Sunni communities. Death squads were organized. They were already in existence, but they were unleashed, and they had 2 different kinds. One was the Interior Ministry itself, which, once these elections were set up, were immediately taken over by Shi'i Islamists. So the Interior Ministry, the most powerful internal security ministry in the country, is controlled by Islamists, while the Americans stand cluelessly by. And from militias. There are all these militias that have sprung up because people need protection. They're in their neighborhoods. They're basically like neighborhood gangs to protect the neighborhood, keep the bad guys out of the hood. And this was what was organized throughout the country. Da'wah, Jaish al-Mahdi. They systematically attacked Sunnis in mixed communities in Shia majority areas and elsewhere. And Baghdad was ethnically cleansed. The little picture there shows one of the favorite methods of execution, electric drills. This is a very violent part of the world. So, they win. Right? They win the battle for Baghdad. Something like 700,000, 800,000, we don't really know, maybe 750,000 of Sunnis were driven out of their homes in Baghdad. Some of them moved to other neighborhoods of Baghdad, and they fled. Baghdad in 2003 was about 50% Shi'i. The rest, largely Sunni Arabs and also some Kurds. By 2007, the city was 75% Shia. And remember, again, this is a very big city. We're talking about something like ethnically cleansing, maybe not quite L.A., but something, let's say, Chicago. I mean, this is not something small. This is a very large city. And overwhelmingly, the majority of Iraqi exiles, of whom more later, are Sunnis in Jordan and Syria. Here are some hapless suspects being arrested by the Interior Ministry. The fate of these individuals is unknown. And there are a lot of studies that try to track this. It's very difficult to do, of course, because this was extremely violent. No, you would never know what was happening to you. Even the best reporters like Nir Rosen, who speaks fluent Iraqi Arabic, nearly got killed. So did Patrick Coburn, equally skilled, a reporter, Irish reporter for the London Independent. Both of them tell stories of being very nearly killed a number of times trying to get stories. This is really dangerous. It was a gigantic gang war throughout one of the biggest cities in the Arab world. It was really awful. But of course, it ended because there's a study done actually down at UCLA, I believe, in environmental planning by looking at looking at satellite imagery and using night photographs so you can see where lights were before and after and how the lights kind of go out in Sunni areas because people are fleeing. Very interesting. Shows this kind of ethnic cleansing wave, how there is a kind of crescendo, how it rises and then it falls, and how. Now, notice this decline, okay? Notice this falling off of the death rate. And this then led Americans to saying, well, the war's over, right? And you don't hear so much about Iraq. And it looked like it was over. But remember, it was only with respect to this horrendous killing that was going on during this battle for Baghdad. I mean, here's Iraq in 2008. What were the estimated annual deaths? Well, compared with deaths in ethnic wars that were still going on in Sri Lanka or Kashmir, even after the worst was over, it was still higher. Admittedly, it was less than the Lebanese Civil War, but that wouldn't be the case if we went back and looked at what was going on during the battle for Baghdad. So, at this point, George W. Bush is under extremely rising pressure from the American people about this war. It looks like a loser. And he and his advisors come up with the idea of the surge and the awakening. Okay? There was basically a shift in U.S. tactics to, instead of fighting the insurgents directly, they did what's called counterinsurgency. They had this idea of saying, well, look, we're going to go back out into these communities. We're not going to just go out there and come back in. And we're going to try to find local allies. And we're going to try to get local folks to ally with us. One thing, though, three things have to be remembered about this. The kind of hype that this has gotten in the American media is grossly distorted. Why? First of all, you've already seen that there was reason why the Civil War was already ramping down for the very simple reason that the Civil War was over because the Shia had won. They had driven most of the Sunnis out of their neighborhoods in Baghdad. So that ended it. Furthermore, Muqtada and the Jaysh al-Mahdi did, under the advice of the Iranians, said, don't fight. Don't fight the Americans. This is going really well for us. We're winning. We Shia Islamists, we're doing just fine. Don't fight the Americans. We're wasting your time. You're going to have to take heavy casualties. Let the Americans do the fighting for you. Let them go out and go after all these Takfiris whom we hate and whom are killing us anyway. We don't need to do it. Just wait, and we'll be in a very good place. So there's a way in which there was the Shia sort of stood aside. They had already basically gotten what they wanted. They had already ethnically cleansed the place. Now there was pressure on Muqtada. And the Iraqi state already had Nouri al-Maliki in power, and so there are these struggles within the Shia community. But that struggle, although there was fighting between them, there was a kind of ceasefire between the Jaysh al-Mahdi and the Iraqi state of Maliki, and those negotiations were facilitated by the Iranian Republican Guards, because again, they didn't want this going on. What about the Sunnis? Well, at this point, many Sunnis were more afraid of the Shia than they were of the U.S. forces. And then a lot of the tribal groups and ordinary Sunnis were really furious at Al-Qaeda, based in the Sunni community, because they may be Sunni Muslims, they might be Ba'athis, they might be secular nationalists, or they might be Sunni Islamists, but they might not be Takfiris. They might think that it was stupid to attack the Shia, for example. They might think that this was a bad tactic. So they decided, okay, we're going to do a deal with the Americans. And so we created other groups, Sahwa, or the awakening movement in Arabic, of arming various of these Sunni groups. Okay? Some people think at the time this might be trouble for the future. Maybe these guys will come back. Who knows what will happen after the elections on Sunday in Iraq. There are elections on Sunday in Iraq. And we'll see what happens. But there are other people who think that the Sunnis are basically, it's finished. I think that's premature. But there is this argument that basically we've pulled another Afghanistan by arming various groups out there, and it suits us now, but then later on, do we have any idea what these people will do? These are Sunni Arab nationalists or Baathists, tinged with Islamism perhaps. I mean, who knows what they're likely to do? It's not at all obvious that they're necessarily going to be friendly to what the American government wants. This is an official U.S. government map. It sort of shows how there was this decline in al-Qaeda activity in various places. And so you get this situation of the violence going down. And the Iraqi state, although it is weak and deeply corrupt, beginning to consolidate itself to some extent. And so now there is a struggle towards the end of the second Bush administration about something called the Status of Forces Agreement. In international law, anytime the United States, or anyone else for that matter, has bases in another country, there is an agreement called the Status of Forces Agreement. It's an international treaty. Essentially, it's an international treaty. It has binding status in international law, and so it was being negotiated. Now, Bush and his group initially thought that they could keep the bases. We were building huge bases, a huge embassy, and that we thought we could maintain troops until whenever, as George Bush said, whenever the Iraqis stand up, we will stand down. And when would that be? Well, we decide that. So you can see, to many Arabs, this looked like a project for long-term occupation of a country with vast oil reserves. So it wasn't very popular. You also know, because of looking at modern Iraqi history in the 20th century, how deeply unpopular the notion of foreigners having bases in Iraq was under the British. It was a constant, remember that? There was constant conflict. So this is not going to go down well at all, given Iraqi history and the views of Iraqi. And they had other ideas. Sistani was very protective of Iraqi sovereignty, and Iran, which hardly controls the Iraqi government, which has its influence, also clearly does not want a long-term U.S. presence. So there has always been this deep contradiction. Okay? Nationalists and Islamists, who together make up occupy the large majority of the political space in Iraq, both of those kinds of groups, and there are overlaps among them, of course, they don't want us there. Right? This is a big problem. You can't very well stay in a country where people overwhelmingly don't want you around. And so we negotiated the Status of Forces Agreement. It says, it's available online. You can look it up and read the whole thing. It's about a 12 to 13-page document. A lot of it is very boring. It has to do with who pays for the moving of trucks and stuff like that. But it includes all U.S. forces leave all cities and towns by June of 2009, and this has actually happened. U.S. combat troops, it's not just combat troops, note, okay, by December 31st, 2011, all U.S. forces, that's a quote from the sofa, are to leave Iraq. We're not supposed to have any troops left by December 31st, 2011. All U.S. military action has to be coordinated in advance with the Iraqis. We are not allowed to use Iraq as a base to attack neighbors like Syria and Iran. And there was a very weak this SOFA passed by a very weak majority in the Iraqi parliament. It was something like, out of 275 members, you can see that attendance was down when they held the vote, and it passed by barely. There was supposed to be a national referendum on this, which has been postponed. And the way this works is, in a way, a kind of classic case of the story often told about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was, during the New Deal, met with a group of union leaders who said, you know, we want you to pass a law that makes it easier to organize workers in union factories. I mean, we want you to do this. And he said, you're right. It's a good idea. I want to do it. I'd like to do it. Now go out and make me do it. meaning that he needed to have political pressure on him so that he could make this happen. And this is exactly what happened with the Sofa, because the Sadrists, the Jaish al-Mahdi people, were demonstrating against the Sofa on the grounds this is a sellout of Iraqi sovereignty, which then provides the kind of, and then Maliki can say, well, wait a minute, look, I mean, he can say to the Americans, look, you want this? You want this to happen? Is this what you want? We just don't have any agreement, and you have no basis legally for having your forces here. The Americans were desperate to get this agreement. They had to have it in terms of international law. Not that we would are above violating international law, but it would have been, to put it mildly, very inconvenient politically, and there was this pressure demonstrating en masse against the Sofa. So, that's the situation. We'll talk later on in a bit about some current discussions. But remember, the Sofa is a legally binding agreement, first. Second, the Iraqi government itself is composed of Islamists and Shi'i Islamists and nationalists. Third, there is a very long and bitter history in Iraq of opposition to foreign military bases and troops. And fourth, there are the government of Iraq is itself under lots of pressure, so it needs to play the nationalist card in order to maintain popularity. All of these suggest strongly that, in fact, it will be very, very difficult for the U.S. to continue to maintain troops in Iraq, although there are plenty of people in Washington and elsewhere in this country who think, strangely, that this would be a good idea. Now, one of the themes of this class has been unintended outcomes, right? People may have goals in politics. They may think, well, here's Iraq with a weak state, and look at all the oil that's there. If we go in and invade, then we can just take this over, and then we can help break up OPEC, and all those good things. You can see how, and there's evidence that some people thought this. But just because those are your plans, from this, it does not follow that you're actually able to get that to happen. Because other people have other ideas, and politics is a world of conflict. And consequently, the outcome of that conflict may not be anything like what you would hope and plan for. So the question is, who got the oil? Did they get the oil? In fact, they wanted to. What happened? There were high hopes, right? Huge resources. Underexploited for a long time, some entirely unexploited. Saddam was first there was this big war in the 1980s, under very strict sanctions in the 1990s. People were thinking, wow, all this stuff under the ground, and very little has been exploited, so, boy, there's a lot of oil to be found there. There was also a hope, and this was talked about at the time in the sort of 2000, I'd say 2003 to about 2008, 2007-8. There's a lot of discussion of things called production sharing agreements. Remember that the way things worked after the end of the struggle for cash and control in 73, 74 was that national oil companies became the sole decision makers about oil, and that foreign companies, which were often welcome in the country, were essentially services contractors, right? So all the rents accrued to the government. The idea behind a production sharing agreement was that the oil companies would not just be paid some fee, but they would also get the oil itself. They would then have oil, barrels and barrels of it, which they could then sell so they could capture some of the rents. Now, of course, they would not get all the oil, but let's say the idea was proposed, well, under this production sharing agreement, the government will sell 80% of the oil, and we'll sell 20% of the oil. That's saying we get 20% of the rents, right? Okay, because that was the idea. So that was the notion, that this was going to happen. There was much pressure on the government of Iraq to do this. Lots and lots and lots. But guess what happened? Nationalism, again, blocked all such attempts. It hasn't happened. Okay? They kept trying to get it. It kept not happening. So far, there are only two. This slide is slightly out of date. I think there are more since then, but largely they've gone to Shell Oil and a few other companies and to the Chinese. And indeed, oil. There is a lot of oil. This map that you can look at online shows, particularly pay attention to the undeveloped, the green. There is lots of green on that map, lots of oil that nobody has ever exploited before that looks really good. It's located mostly in the Shi'a areas and in Kurdish areas, although in some disputed areas. And oil production did not really recover, right? It's flipped around. You notice in the 1970s, then notice in the 80s, first it collapses because of the war and in the Persian Gulf, but then it goes back up, collapses entirely during Operation Desert Storm, and then gets back up, but it has never really recovered fully to before. Here's a man, a famous Texas financier and oil man named T. Boone Pickens, who had this to say about Iraqi oil. They're opening them up to other countries all over the world. We're entitled to it. Okay? And then we leave there with the Chinese getting the oil. Unintended outcomes are to be expected in history. Just because people think that, we can go invade this place. And what did they think? They thought we could go invade this place and we would have a government that would welcome American oil companies. We could roll back and go back to the good old days before 1973-74 in the oil business. We could break up OPEC and we could weaken Saudi Arabia and, above all, we could weaken Iran. We could have a government in Iraq that was going to be friendly and allied with the United States. We would have a democracy that embodied all of our various virtues as a polity. None of those things happened. And the slightest attention to Iraqi history would have shown you that it was highly improbable that any of them would happen. And so, sure enough, they didn't. Saddam was captured, tried, and executed. The execution was done by members of the Jaish al-Mahdi who were chanting Muqtada, Muqtada as he was praying while they hanged him. This was done on TV. This did little to improve the image of Muqtada's folks in the eyes of the Sunnis. He has a grave in his hometown, and Sunnis are not reconciled to this new order. And this is most unlikely to change anytime soon. And one thing for you as students of Iraqi history to remember, the Kurds were able to destabilize the country of Iraq for over 50 years. They revolted when the British first came in, and they fought the Iraqi states ever since. They were a constant source of instability. If they could do this, and they had, at best, very fickle friends in Iran from time to time who would sell them out, what do you think Sunni Arabs can do with all their friends in the Arab Gulf and throughout the wider Sunni world? Well, one is entitled to wonder how stable all this is. So, let's look at the balance sheet. And this is a truly miserable story, but we need to go through this. First, we need to talk about the human costs. Then I'll talk about the U.S. domestic costs. And then finally, the strategic outcomes. So let's talk about human consequences first. 3 things to look at: the U.S. casualties, Iraqi casualties, and refugees. So, what about our casualties? The good news here is that our casualties have gone way down because violence in Iraq has subsided greatly. After all, there was a civil war in Iraq. It's over. The Shi'a won. Over 4,000 U.S. troops were killed. That's as of last month. 2 months ago. Wounded variously, kind of depends on the kind of how you count, but it's a substantial number. And the nature of the wounds is very important to pay attention to, because remember, a very large number of these troops were wounded through improvised explosive devices. So a very large number of these wounds include head wounds, head trauma, and loss of limbs. So this means that these guys, and they're usually guys, some are women, are going to be impacted for the rest of their lives. It's important in terms of thinking about casualties in Iraq, if you're trying to think about American casualties and comparing it with other wars, to realize that there is such a thing as a very important thing of medical progress over time. U.S. doctors and doctors throughout the world have gotten better and better and better over time. For instance, it's very useful to look at the ratio of wounded soldiers to killed soldiers in World War II. About 2.3 to 1. So for every soldier killed, there were about 2 or so who were wounded. In Vietnam, that number had risen. Why? Because battlefield medicine had improved. So some of the guys who would have died had they been fighting in World War I did not die. And so the ratio of wounded to killed goes up. What does it look like in the Iraq War? 7 or 9 to 1. So there's been a huge change. That's the good news. Those folks didn't lose their lives. The bad news is many of them are very seriously injured, and will require care for the rest of their lives, because that's what happens when an IED hits you. Okay? And so the victims in the United States are numerous. And of course, there's also the widespread phenomenon of post-traumatic stress disorder, and this is widespread. Here's what the Veterans Administration Secretary Eric Sashinsky had to say. 20% of suicides in the U.S. are committed by veterans. On average, 18 veterans commit suicide every day. There is a gigantic literature about this. In the reading by Chris Hedges, you can see some allusions to this about the impact on people, not only of the kind of violence they witnessed, the kind of violence that happened to them, but also the kind of violence that they have no choice but to inflict on others. That turns out to be almost as traumatic. There is a very good book, a very disturbing book by a man whose name I've forgotten. It's called On Killing. He's a retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, and he teaches at a college in Arkansas. We are not talking sort of Santa Cruz lefties here, but he talks about the kind of consequences of what happens to you psychologically if you were trained and then go out and actually do this. This photograph next just was from very recent, I think 2 days ago, is the oldest and youngest daughter of a man who was a Persian Gulf War veteran who committed suicide at his grave. And so, again, these kinds of consequences, of course, don't merely touch the people themselves. They touch everybody who was close to them, and so there is a way that this spreads out. This kind of suffering and trauma and devastation spreads out amongst us. So that's what happened to to Americans who went off to fight there, being told that they were instituting democracy and doing good things. These were very brave people. It was very unfortunate that they were so systematically lied to about what was actually going on. What about Iraq? Well, of course, in Iraq, it was much, much worse. We don't, of course, know how many Iraqis were killed, because the United States government, for one thing, refused to keep count. The general in charge during the invasion of Iraq, General Tommy Franks, said, we don't do body counts. And so we can have different kinds of estimates. There is a British organization with a website, and it is called, they do what they call the Iraq body count. Their method is that the death must be recorded somehow in some newspaper. This is, of course, a lower bound, because you can imagine in a giant gang war, imagine if there was no authority in L.A. and everybody was angry and we'd flooded the place with even more guns than we have already, and we have months and months of fighting. Well, you can imagine that a lot of folks are not going to get recorded. Reporters will not go there, as we mentioned before. So it's a lower bound, okay? Has to be taken as a lower bound estimate. In June 2006, their lower bound estimate was 45,000 Iraqis had been killed by their current estimate is at least twice that. And this is because of the surge. They have a very useful graphic which shows the surge there in the middle, that little bell curve. That's the battle for Baghdad. That's the civil war in Baghdad in particular, where the Sunnis are being hammered by the Shi'a. Okay, that's one methodology. The other methodology is to do household survey estimates. And this became a great big debate in the United States, in the press. And basically what happened was that people from public health institutes, people whose lives are devoted to doing public health surveys, ran surveys. These surveys, of course, are like any other survey. They're imperfect. And it's dangerous to do this. And so there are all kinds of issues. They used a technique called in statistics cluster sampling. That is, you don't sample from the whole population, but you take clusters and then you sample on groups, and then when you go to a group, then you simply select randomly, okay? It turns out that statistically this creates broader confidence intervals, but it's a method that is widely used in post-disaster assessment. It was used in the Congo. It's been used in Liberia. It's been used in lots and lots of countries to try to assess after the fact, and the people who did this were experienced, right? So they published an article in the Lancet magazine. They were researchers from Johns Hopkins University, that as of June 2006, there were some 600,000 excess deaths. They were denounced as stooges of the Democrats and the left, and they said, look, we'll stand by what we do. There were all kinds of attacks. One statistician said a lot of these attacks show that this study is flypaper for innumerates. people who can't do math at all because there's nothing wrong with what they're doing. But there is a big debate about the accuracy of this, as there always is in any kind of statistical methodology. If you extrapolate from their estimate, which let's say might be an upper bound estimate, maybe 800,000 to over 1 million people lost their lives as a result of our invasion and occupation. There was a British polling agency which in 2007, after some of the worst of the violence had abated, which came up with something similar, about 1 million, which is an interesting statistic. What about the wounded and the maimed, like in the United States? The truth is, we haven't a clue. We have no idea, but it, of necessity, must be rather large. Probably not on the same scale as the U.S., because their access to high-quality surgical care was necessarily much, much worse. So it's probably much more like World War II, or maybe worse than that, but nevertheless, it will certainly exceed the number of folks who were actually killed. And this, of course, comes on top of, as we saw, the well over 250,000 excess child deaths as a result of sanctions in the 1990s. So Iraqi society paid a very heavy price for their history. This is a map that shows from the Johns Hopkins studies and MIT as well, showing this kind of thing. Now, it's interesting to remember, sometimes it's kind of hard what are these numbers? What do they mean? And what's a very useful, simple technique is to say, well, what would equivalent numbers mean in the United States? Right? We're a much bigger country than Iraq, but we know our country much better. So it's a helpful exercise to simply say, well, if we had suffered casualties along the same lines as the Iraqis, what would that mean in American terms? Well, if you take the upper bound estimate of the Johns Hopkins and MIT studies, this is what it would mean. Every person in Atlanta, Denver, Boston, Seattle, Milwaukee, Fort Worth, Texas, Baltimore, San Francisco, Dallas, and Philadelphia, they would all be dead. All of them. In other words, this was, in Iraqi terms, even if we lop off half of those cities, we're still talking about a massive bloodletting that took place in this society. So, what about refugees? The American invasion and occupation has created the largest refugee movements in the Middle East since the Palestinian Nakba in 1948. And just as we have heard from the Palestinians driven from their homes in 1948 ever since, I would suspect that we will be hearing from these Sunni refugees as well. 4.5 million displaced from their homes, maybe 1.7 are still abroad in 2009. As Juan Coles of the University of Michigan says, this would be as if, when you count the internally displaced people, it would be as if the entire population of both the state of California and Michigan had been driven out of their homes. That's a lot of people in terms of proportion to the population. John Tierman, Executive Director of MIT Center for International Studies, sums it up like this. The overall figures are stunning. 4.5 million displaced, 1 to 2 million widows, 5 million orphans, maybe 1 million dead, in one way or another affecting nearly 1 out of every 2 people with tragically life-altering or ending impacts. If you want to read more about this, you can go to the MIT website, Human Cost of Iraq, which has all kinds of articles and analyses of this. This is not new, I regret to say, in human history. We humans have done this to each other over and over and over again. 2,000 years ago, a man named Karl Gacchus said this of the Romans: they make a wilderness and they call it peace. Solitudinem faciunt pacem appellunt. And this, you will notice, is something that we're doing today. We say that we have made peace in Iraq, and now Iraq is peaceful. Notice what this means. Notice what the consequences were. So those were the consequences in human terms directly. What about the domestic U.S. consequences? Well, of course, most notably, we've had an assault on constitutional procedures. We have the shredding of the Bill of Rights. We also have, as we will see momentarily, extensive economic waste and corruption. And distraction, of course, from our very serious domestic problems, as we see today on campus here. And, of course, distraction from our even more serious environmental problems, like the problem of global climate change, biodiversity loss, and the like. And all of these we're distracted from because we're all fighting these other wars. The great philosopher Voltaire long ago said, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And this is what happened to us as Americans during the Bush invasion and occupation of Iraq. We got Abu Ghraib. We got Americans torturing people with the approval of the U.S. government. We set up the Guantanamo system of imprisoning people without due process. Notice, by the way, the state of Pakistan, which is itself under attack by Islamists internally. Bombs are going off. Whole provinces have to be reconquered by the Pakistani army. And yet, in Pakistan, when they arrest Islamists, they put them on trial. If they arrest terrorists, they try them. Okay? We, however, are saying, oh no, we can't do this. So is our democracy really weaker than Pakistani democracy, which has seen repeated coups? It's beginning to look like it, but it is, to put it mildly, rather disturbing. If you want to inform yourself better, this is an online film, torturingdemocracy.org, which demonstrates that, in fact, torture was approved at the highest levels of the U.S. government. Indeed, this is really not news anymore. Dick Cheney has basically come out in the last several months to say openly and proudly that, yes, indeed, we did approve this. We think it was a good thing to do. And remember that in all these crimes, all this devastation, that as we have seen was essentially for nothing in terms of what was actually accomplished. Long ago, Justice Robert Jackson, who was the chief American prosecutor at the Nuremberg Tribunal for the Nazi war criminals, said the central pattern of these crimes, the kingpin which holds them all together, is the plot for aggressive wars. We launched a war of aggression against Iraq. There was no reason for it. They were not a threat to us. Our goals made no sense. We have seen that they were not accomplished. It was highly improbable they could have been accomplished. All history, all logic, all reason went out the window, and we did this. And it cost a lot of money. Okay? A lot of money. A lot of money. Here's a graph showing total war allocations. Green is Iraq. Orange is Afghanistan. These numbers don't include the current Afghan surge for 2010. And that's a lot. And this is budgetary costs, okay? These are current budgetary costs. But of course, that's not good enough. In economics, no reputable economist would stop there. They would say, no, you have to talk about projected costs into the future on debt payments, and also the care of these veterans who will require care for the rest of their lives, which will have to be funded also from the public purse. It will be quite rightly funded from the public purse. This is legitimate. But if we think of the total economic cost, we have to take all this into account. What are we? Let's look at this. Here's Joseph Stiglitz on the lower left, one of the giants of modern economics, one of the pioneers of the theory of imperfect information and its implications for markets. He is, to put it mildly, a brilliant guy. He teamed up with a woman named Laura Biles, who was a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. And what did they do? Their estimate, a modest $3 trillion. He's actually said that he thinks his estimate, which he did a few years ago, is now too low. It should go up. And so, in honor of today's activities on campus, I prepared 2 more slides where I just did a little back-of-the-envelope calculation. Let's take the example from California. Now, there's a website called costofwar.com, which when you first go there has a clicker with numbers, how much money has been spent, and it's whirring by on the lower digits, you know. It's like one of those clickers, and it shows. And then you basically, with the methodology, these are budgetary costs, and then you take it, and then you simply pro-ration it by the percentage of a state in the population, right? So say it's pretty much equally shared. So that you come up with this estimate of $114 billion, the total Iraq and Afghanistan war spending since 2001. So question, as you would always ask, in the first day in Econ 1, when I used to teach Econ 1, you introduced the concept of opportunity cost. It is the fundamental concept in economics. What could you do instead? What could you do instead with $114 billion? Well, you could do a lot of things, but let's just look at one thing you could do with it. Let's look at what you could do with it if the University of California got it. Okay? Now, if you go to the UC website, what you'll see is that the cost of a year living on campus is estimated by the admissions office as about $27,000. That's a nice round figure. Well, let's work with that, because this is just a back of an envelope calculation meant to be suggestive. So $27,000. According to the UC system, about 190,000 students are enrolled throughout the UC system on all 9 campuses. So multiply these 2 numbers together and you get the total cost of all 190,000 students for a year, at UC we come up with about 5 billion. So then we take that number for 1 year and we multiply it by 4 years and we get 20 billion, 20.5 billion. And we compare that to 114 billion. And we divide 20.52 billion into 114.9 billion, we come up with the number 5.6. What does 5.6 represent? It says that with the money spent on Afghanistan, 5 entire classes of students throughout the University of California system could go to UC for nothing. Zero. No cost to you and your families for 4 years. And one more class, because it's 5.6, a little more than, could go for 2 years. So the opportunity costs are significant. Right now, of course, this would never happen, right? If we didn't do this, obviously it would be spent in lots of other ways. But it's suggestive about the impacts and about where the budget, where the real problems fiscally in terms of priorities in the United States really are. The priority, if we're spending huge amounts of money to fight useless wars that don't even accomplish the goals in the first place, and those goals themselves are diluted, we shouldn't be trying to seize the oil in the first place. It was ridiculous to try to dictate the modes of governance to Muslims. It's crazy. It can't work. How could it work any better than our attempts when I was a kid trying to dictate the modes of governance to Chinese? It will fail. To Vietnamese. It failed then. It's failing now. It's the same thing. So once again, we're back in Cheshire Cat territory. You can't help that. We're all mad here. So the economic costs were also very significant. What about strategic consequences? Okay. Well, one very big deal is what political scientists call soft power. There are two kinds of power. Hard power, which just means military force, and direct economic coercion. Soft power means the influence of your ideas, your ability to persuade other people. The fact that people look at you and say, those folks, they really make some sense. Well, if you're launching wars that nobody thinks make any sense, and you do it anyway, if you resist the opinion of huge numbers of members of the international community and basically give them all the finger, which is what the Bush administration did, and then you go in and blow up a place and wreck an important country in an important part of the world like the Middle East, and then you start torturing people, and it comes out that that's what you're doing, and you continue to defend it, and then you refuse to try people in courts, which is what we say we're about, which is a government of laws, not of men, not of people, then, of course, our soft power erodes markedly. People begin to say, why should we pay attention to Americans? Americans? Who cares what they say? Americans they lie. They invade countries. They run around beating people up. Why should we pay any attention to this? So U.S. soft power has taken a very serious hit as a result of all of this. It also demonstrated the sham of hard power. Think about it for a moment. The United States military, this awesome military, was held down and basically forced to make political decisions that it otherwise would not have made by an insurgency based on the minority Sunni population of Iraq. That is a population, a reasonable estimate would be about 5 to 6 million people. In other words, an insurgency based on a population roughly the size of the population of Los Angeles County was able to tie down and stymie the United States military for a period of years. What kind of message does this send? People say, well, they can invade. They're certainly going to kill a lot of people. But out there in the hard world of international politics, where people are willing to fight and die over all kinds of ideas, this does not send much of a message. It says, well, they can come in here. Okay, they can do it. But if they do, we can make them pay a very serious price. It has led to a lot of estrangement of our allies, though number 1 and number 3 work together. This is particularly visible in Europe. And the main beneficiaries were clearly the ideology of global jihad. Osama, I want you to invade Iraq. This has been, you can read report after report of young, deluded, misguided young Muslims who decide to try some kind of copycat terrorist operation. And what do they say? Why do they do it? Because of what the Americans are doing in Afghanistan and Iraq. Right? We hung out a giant recruiting banner for Osama bin Laden by our invasion. It was, to put it mildly, very foolish. And one of Osama's other enemies is the Islamic Republic of Iran, and this certainly helped them, as we'll see in just a second. So after all this, what's left behind? Well, as soon as the Iraqi state got strong enough, after the ethnic cleansing was over, after a modicum of authority was established, after Nouri al-Maliki and other like-minded Islamists managed to maneuver, and this is a very complex political world, but nevertheless, they want a strong Iraqi state. They want oil production to begin to come back, and you know what that means. Put a despotic state, a state with a lot of authority over other minority groups, give them a lot of oil rents. What's going to happen? Repression. And they insisted that the U.S. leave. They want us out of there. The Status of Forces Agreement makes our withdrawal legally binding. Kurdistan has become semi-independent. I have no quarrel with this, but that's the reality. And Iran, as we'll see in a second, has certainly been hugely strengthened by all, and one can certainly doubt that the Sunnis are reconciled to any of this. And so again, we had clueless George shaking hands with a prominent Islamist. This invasion of Iraq not only destroyed things, not only killed soldiers, not only killed all kinds of civilians, had all this human wreckage that will go on for many, many years because of the fallout from it. Not only did it waste vast amounts of money that have very important alternative uses inside the U.S., but it was also a strategic disaster. This was noticed at the time. Here's a man, hardly an Islamist. This guy is a professor of a famous military historian at the Hebrew University, very closely connected to the Israeli Defense Forces. His book, The Transformation of War, is required reading at U.S. military staff colleges. And he said this. He got the date a little wrong there. It's actually 9 of the Common Era, not B.C. And this is what he said. He said that this was the dumbest thing ever done since the Roman legions marched into Germany and were destroyed. This is an Israeli saying this is seriously dumb. Here's another guy, another opinion. I actually knew this man slightly, worked with him a couple of times in Washington after he had retired and gone into, was a consultant. He had been the director of the National Security Administration. That's the sort of high technology spy organization that runs all the spy stuff, the satellite stuff, in the Reagan administration. He had a PhD in political science from Yale. He was lieutenant general. He opposed the Iraq War from the beginning. He spoke out against it. He said, this is turning out to be the greatest strategic disaster in our history. So this was really a comprehensive disaster. It was, as I said, the mother of all stupidities. Well, what's happening now? Poor Obama. As you can see, he inherited quite a mess. This is a big mess. So what to do? The good news is, he starts off by rejecting bad advice. This is always the beginning of wisdom. People tell you to do dumb things and to say, no, I won't do it. That's good. U.S. generals tried to convince him to modify the withdrawal timeline. This was signed just before Obama took office, and he refused to do it. The generals did not want U.S. troops to stop patrolling independently. But again, they didn't want to get all the combat troops out by the summer. Obama said, too bad, that's what we're doing. He overruled the generals and began returning to Iraq its sovereignty. Over the objections of General Odierno, U.S. troops ceased independently patrolling major Iraqi cities last summer. Iraqis now celebrate this as Sovereignty Day. And the government of Nouri al-Maliki has established a kind of tentative control in the country in the wake of the Shi'a victory over the Civil War. Iraqi oil revenues are now about a little under $4.5 billion. That's a good amount of money. You can use that, particularly when you funnel it towards your friends and key supporters, which is what, of course, regimes always do. So maybe Yankee goes home. Maybe. Total troops has fallen from 160,000 to under 100,000. There is an election. It takes place on Sunday. There's supposedly going to be another withdrawal. That's the theory. But on the other hand, we have, after all, constructed the largest U.S. embassy in the world in Baghdad. And these generals are talking about conditions on the ground may slow down our withdrawal. There's a headline in today's New York Times exactly to that effect. And you can see these kinds of discussions. Odierno and Thomas Ricks of the Washington Post talking about this. So there's this repeated idea that somehow we can stay on, somehow we can prolong it, we can still be there. So in politics, as you know by now, it's never over. It keeps on going. Now, if you look back on this strategically and from the perspective of history, you can see that the outcome that happened, the bottom line, should have been obvious from the very beginning, and indeed it was obvious to many of us, and we said so. It was this. Patrick Cockburn, famous Irish journalist, fluent speaker of Arabic, the fall of Saddam was going to start a political earthquake in the Gulf if it meant, as seemed likely, that the Sunni elite went with him. The main beneficiaries were going to be the Iranians, who had, after all, spent 8 years of war, as we have seen and as we will see again, trying to get rid of Saddam in the 1980s. Now, the Americans and the British were doing it for them. Okay? The optimistic view of the situation in Iraq is given by another very excellent journalist, Nir Rosen. He says the state now belongs to the Shi'as. The demographic distribution has been irrevocably changed. Sectarianism rules. The new government is among the most corrupt in the world. How corrupt? Well, once again, let's look at Transparency International, the Berlin organization that ranks countries like this. You recall that we mentioned in talking about Afghanistan that according to their rankings, the most corrupt country in the world, number 180, is Somalia. And that's kind of cheating because Somalia really doesn't have a government. So then the next one was Afghanistan. That was 179. And what's the ranking for Iraq? 176. Who's more corrupt than Iraq? Sudan, Burma, and Afghanistan. So Iraq is, as he says, one of the most corrupt governments in the world. It's beginning to resemble its Ba'athist predecessor in its authoritarianism and brutality, and you know, based on last Tuesday's lecture, that that makes perfect sense. Given the nature of the society and the nature of modern history, this is not very surprising. It faces, however, no immediate threats, and this is his optimistic view. An ugly peace may hold in Iraq. This, from Cockburn, is the view from the Shi'i sacred city of Qum, site of many theological institutions. Some Shia theologians argued that, look, the Americans are invading Iraq. This must be a sign of the end times. It must be a time of the coming of the Mahdi. Why? Because only divine intervention could have persuaded the Americans to behave so stupidly as to get rid of Iran's main enemies in both Afghanistan and Iraq all at the same time. Okay? Thank you very much, Mr. Bush. And as another man I worked with, Chaz Freeman, former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, also to the People's Republic of China, speaks fluent Arabic and Mandarin. Sometimes when you've driven your car off the cliff, there are just no good options on the way down. And this is what we did. We drove our car off the cliff. And so, I'll let Hadi, a woman in Baghdad, have the last word. We are against the Americans. We want them to get out. Just let them say goodbye and leave us in peace. Sounds like good advice. As I say, the good news, very provisionally, is that it looks like the Obama administration is going to do this. This would be good. We are not, as you have seen, we as a country, as a polity, as a society, and as a culture, we are not capable of making dramatic, positive contributions to the governance of places like this. You can see over and over again, looking at history, how diluted that notion is. We need to do this. And we particularly need to do this because although the conflict in Iraq appears to be going down, as I mentioned, there are voices in this country calling for yet another war. I don't think it's going to happen myself. But there are voices saying, what about Iran? And so in the last the last major subject to look at in this class is going to be to look at the country of Iran. It is, of course, half of the Persian Gulf. The entire northern littoral of the Persian Gulf is Iran. It has a population 3 times the size of Iraq, and more than 3 to 4 times the size of the indigenous population of Saudi Arabia. It is much larger than Afghanistan as well. It is a big country, both geographically and in terms of its population. As we will see, it is a country much further along in the great transformation than either of these other countries are, certainly than Afghanistan. And it is a country that has a regime which, although it is obviously loathed by large numbers of Iranians, is nevertheless a revolutionary regime which went through all kinds of transformations and is thoroughly and deeply institutionalized. Last but not least, this is a regime that, unlike the regime of Saddam Hussein, did not face sanctions that wrecked the economy. We talk about putting such sanctions on Iran. As we'll see, there are good reasons to imagine that this is probably never going to happen. So the notion of taking on this country is a qualitatively different kettle of fish from talking even about Iraq. And we've already seen how devastating the attack on Iraq was. Devastating to soldiers and their families in this country. Devastating to the public purse in the United States. Absolutely atrociously devastating to the people of Iraq. Destabilizing to the region with essentially no real benefits to look at. If we thought doing this in Iraq was bad, imagine taking this and raising it by at least a power of 3, if not indeed by an order of magnitude. Then you get an idea of just how nuts it would be. That just because it's stupid doesn't mean that important political figures aren't calling for it, and we as citizens have to remain very vigilant about this. So just a few minutes remaining, let me just kind of give you there's Iran in the Gulf. It's big. How big? Well, it's a little bigger than Alaska. That's a lot of land. And it's very uneven land. It's mostly an arid highland plateau is basically what it is. It looks kind of like this. And so the population tends to be concentrated. There are huge areas that are largely desert. You can see here where the rain is. The rain is along the Caspian coast and then in the west and north of the country. And that, of course, is also where most of the people live. Concentrated again, you can sort of see the way that works. It's the usual case. Okay? And you also see the population density on another map. We know the Strait of Hormuz is absolutely critical, and this is a country that has not only oil, but it is the oldest producer of oil in the region, and it has huge reserves of natural gas as well as oil. Indeed, its natural gas reserves are even more impressive than its oil reserves. It's a big actor inside of OPEC, and its natural gas reserves are second only to Russia. It has the second largest natural gas reserves in the world. Its production has been problematic. Gas was discovered late, and there's the Iranian Revolution. That's what explains that big drop-off. And it has slowly been recovering ever since. Interestingly, this country is largely one religion. A majority are Shi'a Muslim. Okay? And I'll talk more about that, but it's also, next time, it's also important to say that this is a country that is also ethnically different, and yet they do not have the same kind of history of internal ethnic conflicts. One plausible explanation of this is that that Persian culture and the religion of Twelver Shi'ism unites the people of Iran, even though there are actually two huge groups. Let me just show you that slide. Go through quick. I'll go back over this next time. This slide. Right? Persians, people who speak Farsi, okay, are about half of the population. And there's another big chunk of folks, nearly a quarter of them, who are called Azeris. Where do they live? Azerbaijan. The language they speak is a dialect of Turkish. These languages are completely unrelated to each other. Indeed, the current leader of Iran, the Ayatollah Khamenei, is himself part, or even perhaps entirely, Azeri. Okay? But this is no problem. So this is interesting. It's a culture where there has been a way in which the unity provided by religion has overcome the vociferous quality of elsewhere. This does not mean that there are not conflicts. There have been conflicts with the Kurds. There are potential conflicts between Azeris and Farsi. But you do not see the same kind of history of ethnic conflict in this country that we have seen elsewhere in the region. Okay, I'll stop there, and we'll continue on Tuesday. Have a good weekend.
And the people in the streets below were dancing round and round. and swords and guns and uniforms lay scattered on the ground. Last night I had the strangest dream I've ever dreamed before. I dreamt the world had all agreed to put an end